Well, imagine how terrifying Donald Trump, how terrified he has to be for him to follow the advice of his lawyers. That's how terrified Donald Trump is tonight, for the first time. The breaking, not surprising news of the night is that Donald Trump was forced to announce that he will not be having a special press event on Monday to, as he put it, refute the 13 criminal charges against him delivered by a Georgia grand jury on Monday. In a written statement tonight, Donald Trump said, rather than releasing the report on the rigged and stolen Georgia 2020 presidential election on Monday, my lawyers would prefer putting this, I believe, irrefutable and overwhelming evidence of election fraud and irregularities in formal legal filings as we fight to dismiss this disgraceful indictment. Therefore, the news conference is no longer necessary! Exclamation point. That statement is, of course, a lie. There is no report. Donald Trump doesn't have any such report. And Donald Trump's lawyers will not be putting irrefutable and overwhelming evidence of election fraud and irregularities in formal legal filings. They will not do that. Donald Trump is charged in Florida with turning lies about election fraud there into a criminal enterprise. Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyers are not going to mount a defense that says Donald Trump's lies were true. Donald Trump has been terrified into silence by Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis. Another sign of how terrified he is of Fani Willis is what he said about her in that written statement tonight. He called her a publicity and campaign finance seeking DA. Never mind that no one in human history has sought publicity more hungrily than Donald Trump, and no one in human history has more voraciously pulled so-called campaign contributions out of people's pockets to finance his campaigns, his lifestyle, and now his criminal defense. But for Donald Trump to call someone publicity and campaign finance seeking as an insult is as mild an insult as Donald Trump has ever delivered publicly to anyone. This might mean Donald Trump is more in the control of his lawyers tonight. It might mean that Donald Trump has turned a corner rhetorically as a criminal defendant and that he will stop launching vicious, false, racist attacks on Fani Willis and on a federal judge in Washington who is presiding over Special Prosecutor Jack Smith's prosecution of Donald Trump for some of the same conduct alleged by the Georgia indictment. You could see today when Donald Trump taped an interview for the ultra low-rated Fox Business Channel that he is, in Trumpian terms, a defeated man. When a fawning host who commands a regular TV audience about 1/10 the size of the audience watching this program right now, brought up Donald Trump's newest indictment in Georgia, it was as much of a softball as an indictment question could be. And Donald Trump's response was what Donald Trump would call low energy.
I thought we'd just see what you had to say about that.
Sure. It's a witch hunt. It's just a continuation of a witch hunt. They want to silence you. They want to silence you. And they mean silence. They are, I think they're sick people. I think they are people that have no idea how the world works.
Donald Trump rambled on. He never mentioned those sick people again. And he never said a negative word or another negative word about any of the prosecutors in the 4 criminal cases against him, or anything about the judges in 2 of those cases who he has attacked viciously in the past. It was just a very weary version of his witch hunt bit. Donald Trump has not spoken one word of defense in the case that District Attorney Willis is now prosecuting. And now we know that he will not speak one word of defense on Monday or possibly any other day. Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyers were all far too weak and unprofessional to get him to stop saying poisonous, racist things about Fani Willis until she indicted him. And now we see Fani Willis's indictment has landed on Donald Trump more heavily than any other indictment of Donald Trump. Fani Willis's indictment is the indictment that made Donald Trump shut up. And so on Monday, we will not be hearing Donald Trump's defense to the RICO charge he is facing in Georgia. We will not hear Donald Trump's defense to his famous phone call on January 2nd, 2021, to Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger.
All I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have.
That phone call got Donald Trump indicted for solicitation of violation of oath by a public officer. If it sounded criminal to you the first time you heard Donald Trump asking for those 11,000 votes, it sounded criminal to District Attorney Willis, too. And now Donald Trump is indicted for that request that the Secretary of State violate his oath and commit a crime for Donald Trump. But Donald Trump is also indicted on another count for that same phone call. And that is the crime of making false statements to government officials in Georgia, which the indictment says was, quote, an act of racketeering activity. The sentence, "This was an act of racketeering activity," appears 34 times in the indictment. The indictment lists 13 important lies that Donald Trump told in that same phone call to Secretary of State Raffensperger in furtherance of the conspiracy. On Monday, we will not hear Donald Trump's defense of any one of those lies. And Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyers will never be able to defend those 13 lies. Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyers will not dare to suggest that any one of these 13 lies is true. Donald Trump has been indicted on multiple counts of making false statements to Georgia officials. The following 13 lies listed in the indictment amount to only one of those counts of making false statements to government officials. Here are those 13 lies: that anywhere from 250,000 to 300,000 ballots were dropped mysteriously into the rolls in the presidential election in Georgia, that thousands of people attempted to vote in the presidential election in Georgia and were told they could not because a ballot had already been cast in their name, that 4,502 people voted in the presidential election in Georgia who were not on the voter registration list, that 904 people voted in the presidential election in Georgia who were registered at an address that was a post office box, that Ruby Freeman was a professional vote scammer and known political operative, that Ruby Freeman, her daughter, and others were responsible for fraudulently awarding at least 18,000 ballots to Joseph R. Biden at State Farm Arena in the presidential election in Georgia, that close to 5,000 dead people voted in the presidential election in Georgia, that 139% of people voted in the presidential election in Detroit, that 200,000 more votes were recorded than the number of people who voted in the presidential election in Pennsylvania, that thousands of dead people voted in the presidential election in Michigan, that Ruby Freeman stuffed the ballot boxes, that hundreds of thousands of ballots had been dumped into Fulton County and another county adjacent to Fulton County in the presidential election in Georgia, that he won the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election in Georgia by 400,000 votes. The indictment says this was an act of racketeering activity and an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. We have much defendant Trump news to consider in this hour, including his lawyers asking for a 3-year delay in the Washington, D.C. trial of Jack Smith's indictment of Donald Trump for his activities leading up to and on January 6th, trying to overthrow the presidential election. And although Donald Trump is not offering one word of defense in any of the criminal cases against him now, Rudolph Giuliani is trying to defend himself with public comments on his radio show in which he repeatedly and very confusedly refers to Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger as Georgia's Attorney General, for whom Rudy Giuliani expresses his unbridled hatred. Here is a small sample of Rudy Giuliani's defense.
She's taking First Amendment statements and advocacy by lawyers and turning it into a racketeering case. I know Rico. Rico's a friend of mine. I come from Brooklyn, you know? I come from a place that's realistic and knows how to ferret out liars.
We will hear more of the Giuliani defense later in the hour, but we begin our discussion with the consideration of why the Trump defense in the Georgia case has gone completely silent.